Hi, I'm Paul Feinberg. I'm host of UCLA Anderson's podcast. My guest today is Professor Ed Leamer. Ed and I will be talking today about the Ceridian UCLA Pulse of Commerce Index. Welcome, Ed. Let's just start by telling our listeners and our viewers, tell us about the index, how it came in, how you got involved, and what it is.
Well, the Ceridian Corporation is a human resource processing firm. They took over the old Comdata headquarters in Minneapolis, and they do payroll processing. ADP is the biggest payroll processor. They have a pretty big payroll processing operation as well. They have a LifeWorks products. They're the biggest processor of COBRA claims, and they also have a Comdata subsidiary based in Nashville that processes credit card swipes from the trucking industry, where the trucker or an employee of a trucking company is provided a Comdata credit card, and when that credit card is swiped at one of 7,000 truck stops all over the country, that diesel fuel transaction, both the volume and the price, are recorded on Ceridian computers in Nashville within a half a second. Ceridian about 2 years ago came to myself and Charles River Associate, a consulting firm, and asked which of these databases that they have, internal databases, that could they turn into a external product that would help us understand where the economy is and where it's going. We look through all of these, and the one we focus on is this diesel fuel transaction, because we thought that was the most unique and probably the most valuable to add to the conversation about where the economy is going. So we worked about a year making sure this was representative, making sure it was useful, thinking about seasonal adjustment issues. And at the end of the year, we released the product nationally. We come out monthly with an index, which we call the Ceridian UCLA Pulse of Commerce Index. That Pulse of Commerce is a reference to the fact that the interstates that crisscross the country are the arteries of the system, and the product flowing on those arteries is the lifeblood. If you don't move the product, then the economy is going to stall out and really die. So that's the logic for the Pulse of Commerce concept. But the database is much richer than just the monthly release, because it allows us to explore on a transaction-by-transaction basis what's going on with trucking all over the country. So we can do it at great geographic detail, and we can do it at very fine time intervals to the extent that it's of use. And those are the kinds of things we're still exploring.
So elaborate a little bit, before we start talking about results, and I know that there's been some significant results over the last year, but elaborate a little bit about the relationship between the trucking industry and our economy. Why is it such an indicator for you?
Well, we like to say our indicator is early and amplified. Leading indicators are effective if they move early and if their movement is amplified so you can really see it. And that's what the trucking industry does, as measured by our index. The logic for that is that the recessions, which are the most important forecasting event, normally the U.S. economy grows at about 3% quarter after quarter, with hardly any variability over a 35-year period. That constant growth is punctuated by what we call recessions, in which you dip down a little bit and then recoveries when you come back up to a trend. And the forecaster's first and most important job, an economic forecaster's first and most important job, is to tell you when that recession is coming and to tell you the character and strength of the recovery when it's there. So it's very important to have indicators that accurately indicate that a recession is on the way. A recession is mostly about the goods part of the economy, not the service part. The goods is about 1/3, the service sector is about 2/3. In recessions, the service sector keeps on growing. You don't see a dramatic decline. It's the goods components, postponable things, which are homes and cars especially. It's the postponement that really defines what a recession is all about. So if you want to measure the recession, the oncoming recession, and get it clear, you got to focus on the goods component. And the goods requires trucking to occur. And that's why we think this is a very unique indicator, and it's proven itself to be extremely valuable as well.
Now, we spoke earlier, and we were talking about how the index had two goals. Can you tell us what those goals were, and tell us if those goals were met?
Well, Ceridian wanted to use their internal databases. Should be an alert to companies all over the United States too, because they have valuable assets internally in terms of their business records for understanding where their business is and where it's going, helping out their customers. Those databases can be tapped into in the way that Ceridian has. So that was the first idea from the standpoint of Ceridian. We also felt enthusiastic about this because our job is to foresee the economy. And when we saw what this index could do and how it was distinct, we have in this country the index of leading indicators. There are 10 indicators. And this component of the economy is totally excluded. And as time goes on, I think you'll see this added to one of the top 10 lists in terms of leading indicators. So that was the first goal, is to change the conversation about where the economy is and where it's going by adding a totally new index, an index that measures a very, very important part of the economy. But the second thing is a public relations asset. This was going to be very helpful for getting Ceridian's name out there, and that helps support their stock, it helps get them customers, and the same thing is true for UCLA. We have to think of how we can manage the UCLA brand, how can we reach out to our potential customers, whether they're taxpayers or donors or students. You've got to get that name out there. So both Ceridian and myself and UCLA in general were interested in not just affecting the national conversation, but also creating more news and more buzz about what's going on here at UCLA. And that's been extremely successful. And Ceridian is totally happy about the outcome. Every month when we do the release, we're featured on CNBC at 9 o'clock in the morning. I do an interview with Bloomberg with the Hayes Advantage, which is a half-hour interview in which we talk about not just the index, but also about my take on where the economy is and where the fragility is and whether we're going to have another dip or whatever. Those are just two of many, many examples. This thing really has been extremely successful in terms of creating buzz and interest. I think it's just beginning, to tell you the truth. The most successful firm in that regard is ADP, which releases on the first of each month an employment report based on their actual payroll processing, actual payroll checks that were cut during the month before. And they get tremendous news coverage and interest on Wall Street. We're not at that point yet, but I think we'll be moving up to perhaps not the ADP level, but moving up in that direction over the next years as analysts come to realize, become familiar with the concept, which is inherently interesting, the idea that you're tracking trucking at 7,000 truck stops all over the country. What could be better than that if you think about monitoring where the economy is going? So it's inherently interesting, and it's proving itself as an excellent indicator of the health of the economy and the nature of the recovery that we're having. So as those two things become more known, the analysts are going to latch onto this and start to make their stock trades based on it. And when that becomes commonplace, then the media will jump on board and you'll see a whole lot more media coverage. And that's yet to come, the way I see it.
Okay, I know that people watching and listening are going to want to get to your take on the economy and what the index is showing. But before we get to that question, I'm wondering how you came to realize that the index was valuable. Did you have to go back and look at the history of the index and match it up to real history and see if it aligned? Can you kind of explain how that process works?
Well, fortunately, Ceridian has kept their records for a very long time. Most companies tend to discard their records after a few years, but Ceridian had tapes that went all the way back to 1999. In fact, if they had to, they could go before that. So when we were studying this index, I expressed to them that the most important thing is to know when the recession is going to come, and we had to have as many recessions in the database as you could in order to study its effectiveness. So by stretching it back to 1999, we were able to include the recession of 2000, as well as now the very severe recession that we had in 2008 and 2009. So then armed with that data that goes back to 1999, we did a whole lot of correlational studies, econometric studies, to find out what it tracked best, where it didn't work so well, to confirm that the issues that were apparent, which is not a non-representative sample. It's not a representative sample, it's the customers of Ceridian. They don't have everybody in the universe. And to make sure that there weren't long-term trends in terms of fuel efficiency that were getting in the way of the validity of the index, to make sure that there were not rapid changes in modes between trucks and rail. We went through a year studying that database, addressing a sequence of these kinds of problems to confirm that it was really useful. And it turns out that if you want to know where industrial production is, this index does extremely well. If you want to have a sense of imports, also, surprisingly enough, the imports apparently give rise to high levels of trucking activity. And then there's a sequence of other things. Real retail sales are closely correlated with this index. So we worked hard identifying the usual list of possible correlates and to find out which ones it really did work well on. And we're very, frankly, very enthusiastic about the usefulness of this data set.
Okay, so I want to let everyone know we're taping this towards the end of March in 2011. What is the index showing now, and where does Ed Leamer see the economy going over the next couple of quarters, or even out farther than that?
So that question has two different answers. It has two parts and it has two answers.
Okay.
The index continues to be somewhat troubled. We had a very strong recovery starting at the end of the official recession, which was in the summer of 2009, I'm sorry. And then through say June of 2009 until May of 2010, we had what looked like a V-shaped recovery in terms of trucking. Very robust growth, growing at almost the same rate that we fell into the hole that we fell into in 2008 and 2009. So we're thinking this could be a real recovery. A real recovery means 6% economic growth. 3% GDP is normal, 5 or 6% is a real recovery. A real recovery means putting Americans back to work. It means getting that unemployment rate dramatically falling from the 9 to 10% level that it's been in the last year. So we have what looks like the makings of a real recovery through May of last year. But since May, we've been on a different kind of track upward and a rather slow growth. Still growing, no double dip issue, but not the kind of robust growth, extraordinary growth that would signal that we were on a high growth recovery, real recovery track. There are really four scenarios that we've had in mind for forecasting for a couple of years. One is the double dip scenario in which we'd have another decline. We never thought that had much merit, so we called that the double dip delusion in order to cast aspersion on it. The second most pessimistic scenario was the PIMCO new normal. And new normal, along with double dip, have been thrown in the idea trash basket. New normal was we were going to have a decade of 2% growth. And PIMCO seems to me to be running away from that idea. We never thought that had much merit either, because long-term growth is determined by productivity gains. And productivity is all about entrepreneurial, innovative spirit of Americans. And we didn't see that as being fundamentally altered by the financial problems. And so we saw no logic in having a new long-term economic growth. So that left two scenarios, and we've been kind of filtering back and forth between these two scenarios. One is normal growth, which is 3%, with the unemployment stuck where it is. You don't get enough growth to drive it down. So that means about 9% growth, a very slow decline in unemployment if at all. And the other more optimistic scenario, the one that's still a possibility, is a real recovery with 5 to 6% growth, and with unemployment being moved down rapidly. We thought that this time we wouldn't have a real recovery, so we're more like 3%. Our forecast for last year was a little better than 3%. The real economy grew about 3%. Our forecast for this year is a little better than 3%, not 5 to 6%. And we've been growing at that rate. That's consistent with the pulse of commerce. The pulse of commerce is signaling probably a little lower than the 3%, meaning the goods component of the economy isn't showing the kinds of robust growth that would be characteristic of real recessions. So the pulse of commerce is consistent with our view. That view is based on the idea that you normally get temporary layoffs. The job market normally in a recession provides temporary layoffs followed by recalls, in which people do basically the same thing. They go back to the same employer, the same workstation, carrying out the same activity. And fiscal and monetary policy works, or seems to work under those circumstances, because it only needs to nudge the pace of recalls a little bit in order to improve the economy. But there are also, in every recession, permanent displacements in which workers have to find new place to work, new skills, and the process of finding a new job can be very slow, and it can involve dramatic reductions in aspirations, because you might have a great job in the sector that you've been in for a long time, and finding a new job equivalent could take a heck of a long time, and maybe it just requires a reduction in aspirations, so you take a job that is very unlike what you had. This time we think we have a record number of permanent displacements. About 2.5 million jobs in manufacturing have gone away. Some of them have gone to foreign shores, but it's really robots and microprocessors too that are doing a lot of work that humans used to do. We think there's about 2 million jobs in construction that are not coming back anytime soon. We built, at the peak of the housing market, we built 2.2 million homes per year, where normal is only 1.5 million. So that ratio of 2 to 1.5 is a measure of the excess capacity that we built during the housing bubble. We're not going to need that excess capacity. So even though housing starts now at only about 500,000, when they get back to 1.5 million, we're not going to see the employment levels that we had when we had a 2 million unit year. So that's about 2 million workers. And the retail too is not likely to come back anytime soon, in part because Americans are not going to shop like they used to, but also because the internet is playing a bigger and bigger role, as well as computerization at the retail stores. You know, when you go to a grocery store, you don't need to work with a clerk anymore. You can do your own checkouts. So the microprocessor, both in terms of activity at the retail level, but also in terms of the internet, are killing jobs. We think there's about 1 million jobs in retail that are not coming back. So that means you've got 5.5 million out of 8 million unemployed workers who are not going to easily return to the jobs that they had before. And they have to find new locations, new skills in order to find a new job. That's a recipe for a very sluggish job market for a very long period of time. So that's why our forecast is at the lower end of that interval of forecasts, a viable interval which is between 3% GDP growth versus 5 to 6% GDP growth. We're still at the lower end of that and expecting unemployment rate to very, very sluggishly moving down and still high at the end of a couple of years.
Now, I know that one of the nice things or interesting things about the Ceridian data is that it can be regional as well. Are you seeing anything from the index that's specific to California that is or that telling you things about where the state economy is going?
Let me come back to California, tell you a little bit about the regional character of the data set, what it helps us do. This winter, there has been story after story in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times about how it's been a harsh winter, and that's affected the data. When the employment report in February was strong, the Wall Street Journal reported that this was a bounce back from a harsh winter, as if to suggest January was harsh and February was not. I don't know where they get that stuff. So in the midst of these winter times, you're always reading about how the winter made us do it. The reason that the housing starts were down is that we had a harsh winter. Well, with our data set, we can actually drill down into it on a regional basis, on a daily basis, to see what impact snowstorms actually had. And just like with hurricanes, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, gives a categorization of snowstorms from 1 to 5. And in the first 3 days of February, we had a Category 3 snowstorm, which was a very serious snowstorm. Also in January, there was one Category 3 and one Category 1 snowstorm. So we can look at the data on a day-by-day basis to see whether trucking was impacted by the snowstorms at a specific point in time when the snowstorm occurred. But in addition, we can look at the regions. That's that February snowstorm. You're supposed to have a map of the United States in your mind's eye now. that February snowstorm sweeps from down in Texas, through Chicago, up through the Great Lakes, up into New England. So we can look on a regional basis to see if that was the regions that had the weak February. Indeed, that's exactly what happened. All those regions had had declines on a seasonal adjustment basis of the trucking activity. Where we still had trucking growth was in California, in the West, in the mountain region, even in February. We didn't have as strong as we typically had, but we still had it up. So, but on the other hand, so that made us think that the weakness in February with our index was a weather-related phenomenon. But on the other hand, the downturn in trucking was all in the first week in February. The second week of February was a makeup, which was stronger than normal. So by looking at it on a daily basis, realizing that this was a snowstorm that occurred at the beginning of the month, had lots of possibilities for the makeup for the rest of the month, our take is that most of the weakness in the February number, which is down 1.5%, most of that weakness is not a weather-related phenomenon. It had to do with the sluggishness in the economy overall. So that's what the regional data and the daily data, the ability to disaggregate by region, the ability to drill in on a daily basis, that's what that data set allows us to do. You can't do with any other data set. Most of the data sets are after-the-fact surveys that describe the whole month before, and everybody's guessing about what impact weather actually had. Now, coming back to your question about California, what's interesting is the western region, not just California, but the Pacific Northwest as well, it's had a strong recovery, strong bounce back in trucking activity. It was first to turn down, but it's also first to turn around. It's been kind of the canary in the coal mine as far as this recession is concerned. And its trucking volume, unlike the rest of the country, its trucking volume is back above where it was at the previous peak. And in that sense, California's been looking pretty healthy. Now, the February data for California wasn't good. And I was very worried that both on a national level and a California level, we were sticking our necks out and standing all alone. And specifically on a national level, we said industrial production was going to be weak in February, and lo and behold, industrial production actually did turn weak in February. It was a small negative. We thought it was going to be about a zero. It turned out to be a small negative. In addition, California was weak, so we watched the ports, both for exports and imports in February. That port data just came out, and it too was consistent with our pulse of commerce. So we really do think we have something extraordinary going on here, and as time goes on, there's a lot more people going to realize how valuable this index really is.